Hello, thanks for watching and welcome to my video. Now, if you've seen my past videos, you'll know that I'm pretty fascinated by this machine. It's a modern recreation of a Commodore prototype Amiga, the AA3000. That was created back in the day once the A3000 had been launched and was proving successful. The question was, what next for the Amiga line? Well, we never got the AA3000. It was cut down and turned into the A4000 desktop. But in this video, I'm going to be exploring perhaps some aspect of what might have been if the AA3000 had been launched. How are we going to do that? Well, I've been spending quite some time writing some software for this machine, principally the digital signal processor that's on the motherboard hidden down here. Onto that in a moment. Just before we do that, the thing I really want to point out is there's no accelerator that I have plugged in right now. All of this is going to be running off the chips on the motherboard, mainly the 68030 CPU here with the DSP chip. But enough of that, let's actually flick now to Workbench and get this software going, particularly if I can remember what it's called. Now, I'm just going to set this going and stay quiet for a bit just to allow you to appreciate it. Once it's worked its way through, I'll do a second run through and give you a bit of a voiceover for how the software works technically and some of my thinking behind it as I was producing it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Music there was a mod called After the Fight by Boré. Incidentally, credits to him for that music. So, as I say, there it was all the way through. Let's just replay that and I'll give you a bit of a voiceover at the same time. So here we go again. Well, hopefully right at the start of this demo, perhaps I might have got you fooled a little bit with thinking this was just a simple 2D animation. Not that interesting. Or maybe when this started happening, perhaps this is just a rotozoomer that you're looking at. But no, as the cube starts turning, you see that it's a full 3D render. So hopefully that fooled you slightly there. What are we looking at here? It is full 3D perspective texture mapping, all done, incidentally, all rendered by the DSP chip. The CPU is just responsible for chunky to planar conversions and working out the coordinates of each of the vertices, the corners of the object. More on that later. But this opening sequence with a simple cube, just to show off the wonderful colors we got available with our full AGA display and to prove that the engine works. Incidentally, we've got the FPS and polygon counters top left, and clearly a cube's only got 6 sides, 6 polygons, but then I wanted to see how far I could push the engine, and hence this sequence that we're entering now, where we start off with just 8 polygons and then start increasing those and seeing how the engine copes. You see we're at 24 polygons with 30 frames a second, 48 polygons with high 20s, and we're gradually getting closer and closer in quality levels, fidelity to the original Boeing ball, up to 96 polygons. The FPS, incidentally, isn't dropping off that quickly given the number of polygons, and the reason for that is simply that the chunky to planar conversions that the CPU is doing is really the bottleneck here. That's what's holding up the processing, and the fact that we can't render frames any faster than this is chunky to planar, not so much the DSP chip. Clearly, if we go further and further with polygons, then DSP will start holding things up. Anyway, this begins to answer the question, what might have been? Suppose the AA3000 had been launched in its form that it was prototyped in, and we'd ended up with Amigas with DSP chips in. Maybe there would have been a recreation of the Boeing ball demo in full 3D, such as we're looking at here. We will never know. Now, so far, all of the objects that we've been looking at are convex objects. All the polygons are on the outside of the shapes, whether that's a sphere or a cube, which makes them quite simple shapes, but real shapes in the real world aren't like that. They have interior surfaces. And that's what the gear object we're looking at here has. The teeth and the central hole have polygons that are on the inside, and it's really important to render those in the right order. Otherwise, the look of the object will just be messed up and it won't look convincing. So this version of the engine that we're looking at for this object uses Z buffering. So that means each pixel is rendered with the correct polygon on the outside of the object. It does take longer to work through all the calcs for that, but that's what the DSP chip is doing there. Full Z buffering implemented, which is what we have in modern 3D engines, is Z buffering. And finally, we return to the original cube just to allow us a nice simple object to put some really colorful textures on and do some end credits and have some fun with our smiley face. So that's the end of the demo itself. Let's have a little bit of a dive into the technical details of how it's all working under the bonnet. So here's a quick sort of stylized walkthrough how the demo is actually working. We've got 3 main parts to think about here. We've got the DSP chip itself at the top. Come back to what that's doing in a minute. In the middle we've got the CPU, in this case 68030, and at the bottom we've got the user and what they're going to see on screen. So that's our basic structure. Then we
got a number of copies of the screen. To begin with, we've got some chunky screens sitting in the background in fast RAM. Two of those, and the reason why there are two of those will become apparent in a minute. Thing to say about them is they are full 8-bit chunky screens. Everything you are seeing in the demo is 256 colors. Alongside the two chunky screens, we've got two planar screens as well. We need those, of course, because that's all that the Amiga can display. And you'll see how we use all four of these screens together in a moment. So, as I said before, what the CPU does initially is to do the calculations for the geometry of each of the vertices of the object, and it passes those over to the DSP. In fact, what it does is to set the coordinates of each of the vertices in fast RAM, and then simply points the DSP at those and says go, which is what that dotted arrow is representing. So when the CPU says go, the DSP chip then just gets straight on and renders one of the screens, in this case chunky 1 screen, with the object. And while that is happening, simultaneously the CPU looks at the other chunky screen, chunky 2, and converts that using a chunky to planar algorithm to fill planar screen 2 at the bottom right there. So it does that in parallel on those separate screens, and while that's going on, the user is looking at the fourth screen, planar 1. So what the user sees is a completely static and rendered screen, whilst all the activity is going on in the other three screens. So that's one cycle. Once all of that is completed, so the DSP is completed rendering into the chunky 1 frame, and the CPU has completed doing the chunky to planar conversion on the two chunky screens on two screens on the right hand side, everything swaps over. So at that point the DSP renders the next frame into chunky 2, and the CPU goes about converting chunky 1 to planar 1, and the user at that point sees the fourth screen, planar 2. And as we go through the demo, that keeps switching backwards and forwards, so that at all times different screens are being worked on by the different chips, and the user sees the end output. Perhaps all seems very confusing, but the point about it all is that as far as the CPU is concerned, it's always working on a completed chunky image, and as far as the user is concerned, they're always viewing a completed planar image. And thereby you get the nice smooth graphics and not screens being updated halfway through the refresh of the screen. Of course, it would have all been made an awful lot easier had the Amiga ever had a chunky screen mode in the first place, because this chunky to planar conversion wouldn't have been necessary. We could have just seen the chunky pixels in all their glory, but you need a retargetable graphics card for that. Perhaps the other thing to mention here is that the DSP program that the DSP is running is entirely in the DSP's own memory. It's not in fast RAM at all, so the only fast RAM accesses are to the two chunky screens and the object definition. So there's not a lot of clashing going on of fast RAM between the DSP and the CPU. It's only the data, so to speak, in the chunky memory locations that is shared between the DSP and the CPU. And of course the planar screens live in chip RAM memory space. The effect of that is that really what the role the DSP is performing is an ultra simple GPU. The CPU is just setting it up with the object definition and then saying get on with it, render it, and that is much like a GPU rendering in a modern computer. Clearly very much more simple than that, but it means that the DSP and the CPU can run in parallel, which gives an awful large speed up compared to the CPU doing everything. If we run the same demo simply through the 68030, then it would have been something of a slideshow. You need a much faster processor to be able to do the rendering itself. Speaking of the DSP code, what does that look like? Well, here's a quick look at the first chunk of it, hand-coded assembler to get the 3D model working, the 3D engine working. All told, there's a couple of thousand lines of this code simply to do the DSP work, and a similar number in C code for the 68000 code. And I should say that for chunky to planar conversion, I'm using the routines produced by CARMS, those sort of standardized routines. I had no interest in rewriting my own chunky to planar routines, so shout out to CARMS for sharing his routines that are ultra efficient. I'm particularly using ones that are optimized for the 68030 in this program. So I'm very happy with the outcome of this program. To some extent it was just a voyage into the unknown for me. I didn't think I would be able to write a demo program. I've never done that before, and I've certainly not got any background in 3D graphics, so it was all very interesting for me to see how that all worked and the very genesis of modern 3D games. The performance is, I think, pretty reasonable for a 68030 with a DSP chip to get something between 20 and 35 FPS out of it. But it could be faster. So how could we get the modeling and the engine working faster? Well, one way simply would be to upgrade the processor, either by having a faster 030 or moving up through the Motorola CPUs to an 060. And if you do that, the demo still runs perfectly okay, and you will get something of the order of 50 frames a second. If you use a 50 megahertz 060, it can simply romp through the chunky to planar conversion much more readily than the 030 can, and the whole thing begins to become limited by the speed of the DSP chip. So that would be one route, simply throw a more capable processor at it. Second thing we could do is convert all the 68030 code into assembler. At the moment it's written in C code simply because that's a lot easier for me to get it all working, is to write it in C rather than assembler. But if I handcrafted it in assembler, I'm sure it could be a lot faster, particularly the key routines to work on the number crunching would be a lot faster. The chunky to planar is already in assembler. The other thing you might have noticed is that the whole demo is just running straight on top of the operating system. You can Amiga M back into Workbench with the demo running and carry on with some other stuff if you really wanted to, but you know, it would simply be quicker to turn off the operating system, run the whole thing by taking over the machine. There'll be less other things to take into account, and machine load would be less, so that would speed up the demo. Perhaps at this point I should be saying that to play the music mod I was using the PT replay library, which again is OS compliant. If I stopped the OS and ran it all taking over the machine, perhaps I might be able to have a faster ProTracker replay set of routines. That would speed the thing up. The PT replay library, by the way, takes a few FPS, maybe as much as 5 FPS off running that, so perhaps a faster version would speed it all up, and as I say, taking over the machine would do as well. Another possibility for speeding this all up would be the DSP to do all the geometry calculations. So when the object's rotating, all the corners of each of the polygons needs to be updated for the new positions. At the moment it's the 68030 doing that. Actually, if we put that load onto the DSP, that would speed things up a bit. We could also drop the number of colors incidentally. we're at 256. If we drop that down a bit, maybe that would speed things up slightly. We could use a more efficient or a shorter, faster C2P, chunky to planar routine, and indeed the chunky to planar routine itself could be improved. At the moment it is converting full screen rows, so all 320 pixels across, for each of the vertical scan lines that it's got going. Now actually I cheated a little bit and kept the chunky to planar routine at just 100 rows, screen rows, rather than the full depth of the screen, simply to keep the frame rate high enough. The 68030 can't do a full screen chunky to planar in anything less than about 3 frames, so on a 25 megahertz CPU, that is, so it would really slow down the demo to do a full screen chunky to planar. I've restricted that down to 100 rows, but the full width of those rows, if in fact I fixed the chunky to planar routine just to do a narrower region of the screen for conversion, that would speed things up as well. But as I say, even faster would be to have a native chunky video mode, but we don't have that on an unexpanded Amiga. So lots of things that could be done to speed up the routines. To be honest, I think I've reached the end of the line with this engine. It's time to move on to something else, but hopefully it's been an interesting demonstration of what is possible on this machine and what might have been had the AA3000 been released in its prototype form. We'll never know really what might have happened, but it's interesting to speculate. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Join me again next time. Bye for now.